The meeting of Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura in the last round of any competition is like the meeting of Real Madrid and PSG in the final of the Champions League. And so, on the 23rd of September in the 11th round of Titled Tuesday, this happened. Magnus played with white and opened the game with the English opening. After the move e5, white fianchetto the bishop. Nakamura mobilizes the knight and then sets up a barrier on the square c6 so that this scooter rider does not accelerate too much. Carlsen, attacking the central pawn of the opponent, using the fact that after the capture it is possible to take with the queen because the move knight c6 for black does not exist. Such positions, by the way, are often seen in the Alpine variation of the Sicilian defense, but only with reversed colors. Nakamura advances the pawn into the center. White prepares castling. Black develops the knight through the flank so as not to block the diagonal for the light-squared bishop. Magnus takes the king into a safe place. Hikaru nevertheless uses the advanced position of the queen and blocks the check with the strongest piece. And here, the 16th world champion begins an exchange operation with the aim of creating for the opponent an isolated pawn. To take with the knight on d5 is certainly bad because of the loss of the pawn on the square g7. Therefore, Hikaru first exchanges queens, and only after that captures the pawn with the knight. The Norwegian with the next move wanted to get the advantage of two bishops in an open position, because, as Tarash said, the future belongs to the player who has the bishops. The American Grandmaster moved the bishop to the square b6, but Magnus completed his idea, himself giving the opponent two bishops, isolating at the same time the central pawn. Probably forgetting another saying of Tarash, which reads the following: "Who fears an isolated queen pawn should give up chess." Magnus then attacked the pawn with the knight. Black defended. White wanted to deprive the opponent of the main trump card. "Dream on," said Hikaru, transferring the bishop to the king side. Carlsen completed development, probably planning on bishop f6 to offer another exchange. Hikaru had absolutely no need for this, and he placed the bishop on the square e7. The rook went to the open file, though all the invasion squares were covered. Therefore, the American Grandmaster calmly castled. Magnus established control over the central square d4. Black started the fight for the open file. After the move knight f4, Hikaru wanted to return the knight into the center and check the documents of this stray officer. White, of course, could deprive the opponent of two bishops, but in that case the weakness of the isolated pawn would disappear. Black possessed the pawn center. After the move knight c6, his pieces would be placed much more actively than the pieces of the opponent. Therefore, in the game, Magnus refused to capture, and also transferred the knight into the center of the board. Hikaru pinned the horse, indirectly defending the central pawn. White attacked the knight. After the retreat, he freed himself from the pin, creating 3 attacks against the weak pawn. And here Hikaru still gave one of his bishops, receiving as compensation for the isolator even more space and freedom of maneuver. Nevertheless, Magnus did not give up hope to chop down this insolent pawn. Black defended. White doubled along the file. Hikaru acted in the same way, and considering what happened later in the game, probably Magnus should have calmed down his ardor, given the knight fork, then exchanged on the square e6, and opened the way for the bishop, with an approximately equal game. Instead, he defended the pawn on the square a2, so that he could play with the rook. Black doubled. White needed urgently to secure his bishop from the advances of the opponent's pawns, to play h5 with a satisfactory position. In our game, Magnus made the mirror move rook d1, after which Black began to reap the rewards of his space advantage, driving back the opponent's pieces with relentless force and threatening to trap a piece. White defended. Black renewed this threat. And after the defensive h5, Hikaru went for the pawn, using the fact that, unlike in the previous variation, the pawn on the square f3 for white was not there. Just like that, literally out of nowhere, Magnus lost a pawn. His pieces shrank, and again threatened the capture of the bishop. White found almost the only way to save the piece, by counterattacking the opponent's light-squared bishop. But the chess samurai thrust the pawn, like a katana, into the very heart of the opponent's position. Thus, Hikaru showed that in this concrete case, The isolated pawn was not a weakness, but a strength. After the capture on the square d3, he carried out mass exchanges, as a result of which black received 3 pawns against 1 on the king side, and already created for the opponent an isolator. The stage of converting the advantage achieved by black began. The grandmaster activated the king. Magnus offered to exchange knights, obviously relying on opposite-colored bishops. But Hikaru was not afraid of this, because 2 potential passed pawns on the king side, as well as the weakness of the pawn on the square d3, provided black with an easy win. Nothing supernatural was required from the American grandmaster here, just carefully pushing the pawns and the king forward. After the check white exchanged, retreated with the king to the square e2, the black king entered from the right. After the move a3, black advanced the pawn along the h-file, and the leader of the white army did not manage both to defend the pawn on d3 and to restrain the passed pawns of the opponent on the king side, the so-called principle of 2 weaknesses. In the end, Magnus lost the pawn on the square d3. In principle, it was already possible to resign. If Magnus had faced someone else, probably he would have done so. But since Hikaru himself never resigns in hopeless positions, Magnus decided to shuffle the pieces a little longer, and only on the 62nd move did he admit his defeat. The thing was that no defense was visible against the move f2 with the following bishop b5 and the promotion of the pawn. In case of the move bishop c5, the king retreated to the square e2. Then black played h2, f2, and white would have to give his bishop for the pawn. Yes, indeed, friends. Not often can you see Hikaru Nakamura outplaying Magnus Carlsen purely positionally. Apparently, farming rating in amateur tournaments was not in vain, and Hikaru gained strategic mastery there. In the end, the American Grandmaster took clear first place in Titled Tuesday, while Magnus dropped to 16th. Write in the comments what you think about this. Put likes if you want to support the channel. The links are in the description, and see you next time.